Well, I feel I feel like all the good ones have been taken. You
So
can't.
Jessica came up with a really, she said, why don't you call it the sacred stew?
Sacred stew.
The
That
sacred
work?
stew.
Because we're mixing some bullshit up. My girlfriend asked if that's what we're calling our bromance.
Our romance, the sacred stew. That's just laughing her ass off.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. I like to usually generate a few ideas, and I definitely want it to be something that reflects, the generality of the purpose of what we're doing, where we're talking about, heathenism and Asatru. And I think the sacred stew is a really good one, but I at least like to have a couple or a few that, we discuss ideas on the name.
Yeah.
So I like the name Vidar Rising, but I already know a group that's called Vidar Rising, so I can't use that because it's already taken.
Yeah. What about hammer rising?
Rising. Yeah, that's pretty good. Pretty good. Hammer Rising.
Or hanging on Yggdrasil?
Hanging on Yggdrasil. Or what about Teutonic Broadcasts?
Ooh, haven't heard that. Yeah, that's a good one.
It is, but it kind of seems a little too generic.
Yeah. Nine Worlds Radio.
Nine Worlds Radio.
Yakking with Yggdrasil.
Yakking with Yggdrasil. I actually kind of like the sacred stew. Like that name kind of sits with me.
I feel like it resonates.
Yeah,
Sacred
and
stew.
it's and it's something that sparks interest. Like I've been sitting there and I've been thinking about it for a minute. Like people are going to automatically assume we're talking about food, and that's really not it. So it'll spark an interest.
But the people that do know about Asatru and stuff, like they'll know what that is, I feel like.
Yeah.
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 And plus, we'll generate this into different Asatru groups and chats and stuff, so people will get to know it. And
Yeah.
It is what it is.
Yeah. No, I like it.
So-
Like the more I sit here and think about it, I like it.
Yeah, because a stew is what it is. I mean, you put things in there, for flavoring and taste and for health and nutrition, lots of different things.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what we want our podcast to be like. We're discussing and talking about different things that help nourish people and feed them and give them the food and the meat and the potatoes of what they really desire. Food for thought.
Yeah, and it'll be a little bit of, and it'll be we'll cover a little bit of everything except universalism.
Yeah, for sure. We're definitely going to talk about universalism.
I
We're
can't
definitely going to talk about it because that's a subject.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I can't lie. Like the whole I've been like for the last week, like I've really been thinking on like how we got to this point of such a harsh, almost visceral division with people on the universalist side and us on the folkish side, and like what fed it. And then like I've really like found myself wondering if the gods feed both. Like obviously they would have their, obviously like even in even looking at old times, like the gods favor different tribes, but just because one was their favorite didn't mean the other one didn't get something too. And just with the amount of them that I've heard say that they've had interactions with the gods or received blessings, it generally makes me wonder if there's not something there, like I definitely feel like we as folkish heathens get more, but I don't know if I can say that universalists get none. You know what I mean?
Right, right. I mean, I think that's the age-old question that has been at the heart of the debate of, are there more than one god, or gods or goddesses, and really what's going on with the state of paganism and heathenism around the world, culturalism as well, if you want to put it in modern terms. But
Yeah.
whenever you consider what polytheism is that the belief in many gods, many people, many gods, many things. And the universe is made up of multiples of everything. And so, right. And so whenever you feed the energy of one thing, you help it grow. And I think that's a valid point, is that people in other religions have beings and entities as well that are very much just as real as our gods and goddesses. And, you know, it comes down to if they're being fed the energy that from their people that gives them more and more power.
Yeah. And I mean, it could be argued that even though we would say they're doing it wrong and they're misinterpreting a lot of things, they are still given the gods and goddesses energy.
Well,
I don't agree.
Yeah, I mean,
this is strictly that was strictly a philosophical statement for the sake of conversation.
Right. No. I definitely get that. I mean, I'm not so sure when you're talking about like universalists, Asatru believers. I'm not so sure that their understanding of the gods themselves is even a pure understanding, and whether or not they're actually feeding the energy for the gods.
Yeah.
Because they embrace a concept that, you know, essentially it's very similar to the archetypist school of thought, of where gods represent energies and powers that are universal in a sense, and that it doesn't matter where you come from or what tradition, you know, that these archetypes govern over everything. And so they argue, for example, that Loki is this trickster god that's seen in all these different religions. And the problem is they don't put a historical context to how our ancestors actually understood the gods.
No, they put their
modern
thought on they put their modern thoughts and beliefs from the now and project those on the historical past of our ancestors, when their worldview and everything they understood was completely different than what they are thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know,
so I'm not so sure they actually worship.
You said what?
I said I'm not so sure they actually worship our gods.
Well, another thought I had on this was, so correct me if I'm wrong, but when the gods and goddesses bind Loki, they don't bind his lips.
Oh yeah, his lips are sewn shut.
Okay, because the first time I read the first time I read it, the interpretation that I read, I forget which one it was. I don't remember them talking about his lips being bound. And with his like, because where I was going with that is for how much emphasis it seems like they put on Loki. Like to me, it seems feasible that regardless of what they're saying, they're probably feeding him and his brood.
Right. So if you recall the story about whenever Loki Zeus here, and then Thor grabbed him and threatened him with death, that he smash him, uh, unless Loki, essentially fixed the problem, and he went to the dwarves and made an agreement with them, essentially that he would trade his head, if they won the contest of making the greatest gifts for the gods and restoring Steve's hair. Remember that Loki made a bet with the dwarf Broke and wagered his own head, right?
Yeah.
And then when Broke went to go head, Loki, kept his head, was able to keep his head. But what they did was they severed it, or excuse me, they sewed his lips shut, since they were essentially still able to claim the reward of Loki's head, and Broke sewed his lips shut as punishment for tricking them out of being able to actually take his head.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not even sure, because that's a big thing nowadays with this whole Loki worship, where people have like a modern Marvel concept of these gods, and they think that Loki is kind of like the outcast, the black sheep of the family, and it really creates I guess an edgy persona in people that are kind of in the modern emo-ish personas gravitate to that, or people that find themselves in trouble a lot, or on the outskirts of society, outlaws and such.
Yeah.
But I'm not so sure that Loki even has that much power, because he was bound by the gods, and until Ragnarok, his lips were sewn shut, his guts were also ripped open and sewn shut as well. So
I don't know. Like, to me, it's sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
I was just say, like, so if the stories, if there are a timeline to the stories, the incident with Brock would have happened before the incident with Balder, and we see in the Lokacina Loki being able to talk.
Right. So that is whenever Brock is able to sew the lips shut, that's during Lokacina is describing the trial of Loki for everything that he's done, right?
Yeah.
And so you're right, but that's when the gifts were presented to the gods, and that's at the time when Loki was bound and his lips were sewn shut.
Okay.
That's all transpiring at the same time.
Oh, okay. I didn't understand that bit. Okay. Yeah, because like.
So to give a little, or go ahead.
I was just saying, because like well, I don't want to use the term God for Lafay's son, but it seems entirely feasible, even bound with his lips shut, that he would still be able to exude some level of influence, because he is like, well, granted, he's not a god, he is a being with magic, with an understanding of those types of things.
So this gets really deep, because we talk, you start talking about gods and different beings with magic and stuff. Is, first, our ancestors recognized, obviously, the gods. They recognized other beings as well. Jotun and Alvins and Vatir and all sorts of beings that exist. And while it is true that we gave offerings to our gods and such for favor and luck and fortune, it's also true that we would often give gifts in exchange to other sorts of beings as well. I mean, the way of our folk has always been a gift for a gift. You know, when you want something from somebody, you give them a gift in return for a gift.
Yeah.
So as far as Loki being a god, I take the position that he was never a god, that yes, he was a part of the Aesir, but that isn't what makes him our gods. What makes him our gods, what makes the gods our gods, is that they are our progenitors.
Yeah.
They are where we come from and descend from. So while there are Jotun like Loki was, there's different sorts of Jotun as well. And even though some Jotun were good or indifferent, there were others with malintention in their actions and energies, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, so if Loki is indeed Lodor, like some people have speculated, wouldn't he also still have an influence on those that acknowledged him through the gifts that he gave Ask and Embla at the time of creation?
Well, that is speculation, to say that 100%. I personally believe that Lothar is Loki, but that is speculative. There's nothing that exists where we can say, aha, 100%,
Yeah.
But it is sort of easy to make that connection because Lothar seems to disappear from the lore as Loki enters the lore. And it was a fairly common practice to have name taboos on things, things where you shouldn't say the actual name of something because you feed it, you give it power, you call upon it, So
Yeah.
it's very likely that Loki, that name itself, is as a result of a name taboo.
Yeah.
Now, as
Like
far as in its ability to live on, these are beings that have progeny as well, that bred things. Like we know the Lord tells us about Fenrir, Loki, being born from Loki and Angrboda. So we do know that his progeny lives on. One of their children was Laken, which is actually a being that is the host or overseer of a pit in Niflhel. So Loki's cave is located in Niflhel as well. But Laken is the bringer of afflictions and disease and pestilence. It's the Jotun that causes a lot of misfortune upon people. And actually, whenever you think about it, Loki had the power and continued on the power through his own progeny as well. And it does have an influence in that sense. But as far as like asking Loki to specifically do something or for you, I'm not so certain that actually would be beneficial.
I think it'd be like asking to get shot. I think it'd be like holding a grenade in your hand and pulling the plug, not knowing if it's live or not.
Yep.
But it's like it makes but like everything we just talked about makes me think of all the venom and visceral and intentional mistranslations, misinterpretations or just outright um, picking and choosing what universalists want to take from the lore. You know, like if it works for what they want to say, then they'll spout it off. But as soon as it doesn't conform, they fall back on the argument of, oh well, it's just Christianized. We can't take everything at face value. This, that, and the other thing.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a problem with Asatru in general, not just universalists. I think that a lot of people on both sides of the focus argument and the universal argument is, again, we get to the question of historical perspective and understanding the lore in a sequence where there's a historical timeline of when events took place, and that this tells the story of not just the gods, but how our folk came to be as well. But the problem is modern day, everybody, you buy the prose edda or the poetic edda, and the stories aren't in necessarily chronological order, but rather just as they were kind of collected. So that's how people read them a lot of times, and they don't understand that the stories are all linked together in a timeline of events. And some of the stories that exist today that we have, for example, in the poetic edda, like one part may talk about one thing, and it seems as if the whole poem, for example, is all one poem, but then the poem may actually be talking about two things, like they combine two different poems into one, for example, So there's a process that they call the epic methodology, and the epic methodology essentially presupposes one premise. And that premise is that the poetic edda is actual heathen voices speaking about the lore. And that we know it was because of the meter of the poetry as it was recorded, that we know it's in Old Norse when it was spoken in 800 AD, and not when it was recorded in 1200, for example. So we know, for example, that those are original Old Norse poems from the folk. And the way that they were recorded was from Icelandic sailors. Snorri Sturluson, whom wrote the prose edda. A lot of people have the concept of Asatru because of his works. They take his writings and they think that's how the religion was understood. But what they don't understand is what Snorri's point was when he was writing his prose edda. And what Snorri was doing was he wasn't actually trying to write about Asatru. He wasn't trying to write about the old religion. He was trying to essentially bring back Old Norse poetry as a scholarly pursuit, you could say. Yeah. So, and he was writing that book to teach other people how to write Old Norse poetry. And he used the lore because that's what had survived of the poetry. And he wrote a lot of commentary to trying to understand the cosmology and the history of things. But a lot of times he didn't know exactly what something meant, for example. One good example is the 9 worlds, that a lot of people have this concept that there were 9 worlds. But that comes from Snorri. Or the concept that Hel, the goddess Hel, is the daughter of Loki, and I don't know, that I guess she is the goddess of hell and oversees hell, which is another misconception that comes from Snorri. But these things have lived on throughout the years. So the epic methodology presupposes one thing, that the Old Norse poems that were able to survive in the form that we know today as the Poetic Edda or the Elder Edda is the true lore of our people, and that everything else is either secondary, tertiary, or archaeological per se. And anything else that's written, like Snorri or Saxo Grammaticus, if it contradicts what the original Poetic Edda says, then it's to be discarded, because we know that those are original heathen voices speaking the lore. And if something later came out that, for example, Snorri writes, that contradicts that, is to be discarded. So doing that, understanding the lore like that, you're able to pick all these pieces that survived in all these different places, like Snorri and Saxo and Tacitus, and put together the story from the beginning of creation and all the events that happened in order all the way to the end of creation. So the first scholar in, I guess, the Western world since the Christian conversion of Europe was Victor Rydberg. And he recognized and wrote about how the story of the Norse lore actually had an order of events. I know it seems obvious today when we talk about it, but there was a time when people didn't understand this anymore. And he essentially reawakened that timeline, and he recognized the parallels with those stories from other Indo-European traditions and stories as well. For example, like the Slavic traditions or the Vedic traditions. So, yeah. Ooh,
Well,
that was a mouth.
well, I mean, I don't even know if we can realistically say that there being a sequence is common knowledge, because I had never even heard that until we started talking. But then again, when I first found Asatru, and for the first quite a few years, I wasn't necessarily a universalist, but the material I had spoken a lot of that, and I had never heard that. And it wasn't until I got out of prison and I was able to find more books and educate myself that I started to realize that, at least for me, speaking personally, a lot of the more universalist stuff, it was so hollow in comparison to authors and people that had a folkish or traditionalist point of view, that in a way I feel like even after 8 years I've started completely over. And I guess that's why I kind of have a chip on my shoulder with universalists, because I feel like I was lied to for 5, 6, 7 years. So
yeah, no, I understand completely. And there's a long story about universalism. You know, that discussion is probably better to have in a different episode than this first one that we're kind of just ad-libbing as we go here. But with the history of it, I mean, it comes back down to what I said earlier about polytheism and universalism, and what the point is. Universalism is essentially trying to unite everybody under one understanding, concept, religion, and law. And I mean, from the very beginning of civilization, you can see every time that somebody came with a universalist type of philosophy or theology, like monotheism, for example, it was always to conquer other people and make them believe what you believe. But theism always recognized many people, many gods, that there are different gods, and they respected those gods. And so universalism seeks to destroy. Now, we know in the universe, there exists nothing but multiples of everything. There is no singularity that exists. Singularity, that universality of things, where it becomes one, is the destruction of the universe, actually. When everything becomes a single thing, that the universe has destroyed itself.
Yeah. When we revert back to Gununga Gap, then
Exactly.
that is essentially the closest we get to a true singularity.
Exactly. But you know, in that, hey, the whole creation process and story, that's probably best for another episode too. But that's those things when you understand about Gununga Gap, whenever that didn't even exist by itself. There was ice and fire.
Yeah. That's actually what I was just about to say. Because even with that, you still had the fires of Muspelheim on one side, the ice and mist of Niflheim on the other. So even that wasn't a true singularity because there was three things to count.
Exactly.
You know, it's on a slight side note, it's also ironic to think about that our faith, our creation myth, is a Big Bang.
Yeah, it is. I think a lot of people don't connect that when they read it.
Yeah, like our ancestors.
Like, yeah, like the rubber band theory, you know, where they say the universe is constantly expanding, but eventually it reaches a point where it collapses in upon itself, and then it re-explodes again, and then it expands, and then it again collapses in upon itself. It's a big cycle that constantly happens. And I think that's the actual root and essence of what our religion is understanding how the cycle works.
Yeah. No, like another thing that I keep thinking about is, so I've read a few like various religions creation myths, right? And of all the ones that I've read, our faith, our ancestors, when as far as when it comes to the creation of the first man or woman, is very different on the fact of, in every other creation myth that I've read except ours, the first man and woman is created before a great flood, a great deluge, and these two, the man and the woman, and in some animals survive on a boat. But when it comes to our faith, there was a great flood, but it was two giants that survived on a boat, and Ask and Embla, the first man and woman, were not created until after that flood. I mean, the difference being a cosmic flood compared to a terrestrial flood. Every other myth being a terrestrial flood here on Earth itself, to where in ours it was, the best way I could describe it, a cosmic flood, because Earth and the Midgard realm were not even created till after that, because they used the pieces of Ymir to make the Earth and the Midgard realm.
Yeah, I think that a lot of our myth is allegory, metaphysical understanding, and literal at the same time. I think all possibilities exist within what's being told to us. And
Yeah.
I think that it is, my personal understanding of it is that it was a cosmic type of flood that happened. But at the same time, I think that the descriptions of the hair and the bones and this became that, I think those are literal and metaphorical representations at the same time.
Yeah.
Because that these beings are necessarily beings as we understand ourselves in our forms. I think these beings also exist in different forms and sometimes just energy. And they have powers unique to them. And if you break it down in scientific terms, like protons and neutrons and this, So yeah, I would agree. It is interesting how our myth does have the first man and woman coming after a flood. But I do think that the gods existed more than just two, survived the flood of Ymir's blood,
Yeah.
because we know that the Aesir Mimir survived that flood. We know, for example,
No.
Odin and others.
If I said gods, I meant Jotuns because it talks about I believe it's Berglamir and his unnamed wife uh surviving on a boat. I meant if I said gods, I meant Jotuns specifically. Obviously, the gods survived. I was talking specifically of Jotuns.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think that there was some other Jotuns that survived as well. I'd have to dig up the information on it specifically. But you're right. Berglamir did survive and his unnamed wife, and they did have children, and they essentially created new lines of Jotun.
Yeah. So I don't know. That's just like a weird thought that like granted, I'm not trying to like go into the whole Aryan theory or this, that, and the other thing, but it does make me wonder if maybe there is something different about our folk in comparison to the rest of the racial groups out there. Because like I honestly can't like unrelated to this specifically, I do believe in aliens and extraterrestrial intervention. So sometimes I wonder if the different human ethnicities are like different projects of different, I don't want to say extraterrestrial, but different beings. Like there's a part of me that like kind of looks at the gods and the other entities as like higher dimensional beings. And being a hard polytheist, I believe there's more than one group. So, like, I wonder if the Asir and the Veneer had something to do with our folk, or created our folk, and then like whatever the Aztec pantheon name is, that they created the Latinos and so on and so forth. Like
Well,
no proof, just a speculation, curiosity.
right. So I think that um, all of the creation myths of different people, their native creation myths, I believe are true to those people. And I would never say, that it's not, because I believe, in line with what you were just saying, that we all have our points of origin and they're different. And the stories may be slightly different, but we do see patterns where the stories are very similar as well. So we know that at some point there's an intersection of things, but I sincerely believe that different people come from different uh, progenitors. But I don't think that it's necessarily racial, because I don't believe in the racialism of it, but I do believe in the tribalism of it, that
Yeah.
different tribes have their different origins.
Yeah.
And I mean, what's the difference between that and racialism? I guess racialism groups, essentially certain classifications based on features, um, as being what differentiates different races. But I don't think that's necessarily a universal truth in and of itself, because I don't think even Europeans as a whole, I don't think that we all come from the same source necessarily. As an example, we can look at the Finnic people in Finland, where in the Sami, where they have a different origin, yet their lore intersects with ours a lot. I mean, the Finns, according to our lore, come from the Alfin, or the elves, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that that's a valid group of people, yet they have a separate lore that's different than ours because they have different progenitors, but it
Yeah.
intersects in the story with us. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm with
Yeah.
you as far as like different beings and different sources of origin. But I don't necessarily, it comes down to, racial terms based on feature, but rather qualities inherent in the soul of where you come from.
Yeah.
Now, you believe that our people, I do believe in the literal understanding of our gods coming down here and creating us and being our progenitors, like Heimdall coming down as Rig and having children with 3 different homes.
Mhm.
And our Lord does describe physical traits of each line. So these are things that became inherent by recognition of where people come from. But I don't think of it in racial terms, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, like, to a certain degree, I think the way we think of race is definitely a very modern concept. Like, not to say that there wasn't race before, but the way we have to navigate that word across the board, I think is very much a misfunction of modernity.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I mean, if you look even at the Germanic tribes, uh, there were various Germanic tribes, and at times they went to war with each other, and they did not see themselves necessarily as the same.
No,
Um,
I mean, like, there's historical accounts of wars where you had two sides and there was just as many uh Germanic and Celtic on either side. You had one army that was a mix Germanic and Celtic and another army of the same mix. Like, we didn't have this, to use a modern term, we're all white people. Like, that's not really how they looked at it.
right.
Which, I mean, to a certain
They
degree,
definitely,
I think is kind of what laid the groundwork for Rome and Christianity to be able to come in and do the things they did, because there was no there wasn't a greater connection. I don't want to use the term unity just because of what we were talking about with, the unit with unification being a destructive measure. Um, they very much believed in their own diversity amongst their tribes, but I think it was to such a degree that uh it allowed outside forces to better come in to divide and conquer.
right. Well, I'm not so sure about that as well, but there might have been a little bit of that. But if you think of it like this, so we can use the Longobards as an example. We know that they come from the Scandi lands,
Mm-hmm.
originally called, and they uh, did lots, and that specific tribe had to go off into the Germanic lands, and they end up coming across the Vandals, and the Vandals essentially tell them in order for them to live in that land, they would have to pay a tribute. Well, in the Winili, they came to a consensus among themselves that they would rather die than pay tribute. So they go to war with the Vandals, but the night before the battle, the Winili pray to Frigga for intervention and help. And Frigga essentially asked Odin, who he was going to decide for the battle. And Odin said, well, whoever I see upon the battlefield first and when I awake will be victorious, right? So Frigga told the Winili to have all their women come out early in the morning time and to take their long hair and braid it around their front to make it look like beards. And Then she turned Odin's bed towards the direction the Winili would be marching from, so they would be the very first ones that would see. And the next morning, as the sun rises, Odin awakens and he sees this great army marching across the hills and the fields. And he says, "Who are these Longbeards?" And thus from that day is, according to tradition, how the Winili acquired their name, the Longbeards. And because they were the first ones seen, they were granted victory that day against the Vandals. So it's quite interesting how we can look at that story and see that different tribes had unique relationships with the different gods.
Yeah.
And they didn't pray to Odin himself. They prayed, because Odin is the grantor of victory, but they prayed to Frigga for intervention with Odin so that they would be victorious.
Yeah.
So we can kind of see how the metaphysical aspects of the gods work in that story.
Yeah. So do you believe that the gods and goddesses could potentially still come and have interactions in this realm?
Oh, I definitely believe they do. I definitely believe that the gods are real. And I definitely believe that they interact with the folk on a regular basis. Now, I think that there's been a mass delusion of reality for our people as a whole. And I think that this has been an ongoing effort for, well over 1,000+ years. And I think that there's a reawakening that's happening because the patterns of history repeating itself and the soul of our people awakening to, the call of what's natural to them.
So in a way you're referring to, I believe it's either the Nietzsche or Jungian concept of the folk soul waking up, like the beast of the north.
Yeah, the beast of the north, if you want to call it that, or
that's my word, but I know it was either Nietzsche or Carl Jung wrote something on the Germanic folk spirit and equated it to Odin as an archetype and the awakening of the Germanic folk. I call it the beast of the north. That's just a personal.
Right. Yeah, no, and Jung was definitely one, and Nietzsche spoke about a little bit. Wilhelm Grombeck wrote quite a bit about the folk soul and how it works. But also von Liszt was another important person that's in the history, modern history, that also spoke about the folk soul. And I think that this concept lived on even past conversion, that people understood how the folk soul worked, because you can see by the way that they name children after specific ancestors, grandfathers, aunts, or uncles, and such, because they believe during that process of a birth, after the birth of a child, that they're actually calling that ancestor to come and inhabit that child, and that, so that the child would have that ancestor's qualities. So I think that tradition lived on, and I think in modern times that a lot of people don't understand that there was a big campaign that happened to try to make it so that people didn't realize where they come from. And I think that campaign is pretty effective, because the mass majority of people out there have no idea about who anybody past their grandparents are. You look at modern America today, hardly anybody knows their family tree.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
It's
like,
sad.
like for me, it's like I never met my dad. I have zero knowledge about my paternal side of the family. Um, I have never met my grandmother on my mom's side, or really anybody past my aunt and her kids. Like, and that's more and more that's becoming a common thing, and it's like listening to what you just said, it makes me think about how some people will try to say that ancestral veneration or ancestral worship was not a thing for our ancestors, when just their naming processes speak to the fact that, I mean, they might not have still had like ancestral altars, but they still venerated their ancestors. Like they still carried on their traditions from the past up until fairly recently.
Mm, and well, I would go even further than that too. I think that they still kept ancestral treasures as memory tokens, locks, pictures. I mean, even in modern day, people still keep pictures of their aunts or uncles. It's a natural instinct to want to remember, where you come from and who your forebears were.
Yeah.
I totally believe it's a natural instinct for us as a people. I think that we've never truly lost that connection. It's just we haven't realized it as much as we should until the modern times today, when there's so many people that are coming to the realization about their roots and their history and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I just think the financial success of services like Ancestry or 23andMe speaks to just the global, not just our folk, but people in general, like feeling that something's missing, and their first response is to reach back.
Right.
And it's just like it's interesting that so many people do that, but don't really realize the context of what they're doing, or they only like really see it at face value. They don't think of the deeper, I guess, metaphysical part of what that can potentially do.
It's because there's so many nuances and on these topics. Like I could just in the last hour when we talked, there's at least 30 episodes right there of different things we can deep dive into.
Yeah,
But
yeah, I was just thinking the same thing. I would like my thought was like we could go back and listen to this, and bare minimum would be like 10, 15 full length episodes we could do just off of what we ad-libbed for this first episode.
yeah, absolutely. And we should do that, man. And actually, that makes a really good segue into ending this specific episode.
Yes.
But I think that we should definitely make sure that we put together more episodes for everybody to listen to, because there's a lot of information that we have to share, and there's a lot of information for us to uncover as we work through the lore, the history, and what it means for us moving forward as a folk, as a religion, as a faith. Next time, I guarantee that the next episode is going to be very hyper focused, and we're going to get to the root of things and come to an understanding of something. What should we talk about next time?
And like I'm also trying to think of something that we can talk about that hasn't been talked about by everybody else.
Right. Well, and I think that we'll have a unique perspective on whatever we talk about, even if it's been talked about with other people. I don't think that with the two of us going back and forth here, just in a natural conversation, that those talks will be anything like what other people talk about. Because number one, I don't know. I don't think that we see the religion the way that most people out there do. So I think that we'll have content and information that's very educational for people to learn about the religion and to understand it as a faith and as a folk, as a one whole unit, as it's supposed to be understood.
Yeah. Well, so I think a good place for us to start, and you're going to be a little bit more knowledgeable about this than I am. I think this one would probably be me more asking questions and general questions and you answering and me giving my input on the answers. But we could kind of lightly touch on the concept of the epic method again in Victor Rydberg, but then we could kind of start to give a basic outline of the timelines of the myths and how they tie together. Because especially getting a lot of new people, or even people that have been doing it for a while that just don't know, I think breaking that down and showing how that is a thing would be a big deal.
I definitely agree with that way to put everything together, because I definitely want to go over the epic methodology. I think that's an important concept for people to understand. I think understanding who Victor Rydberg is, what his work consisted of, and I also think the Noriana Society is another organization I think is important in the history and development of our faith, because they've done a lot of work inspired by the work from Victor Rydberg. They have done a lot of understanding to the religion that I think hasn't been there for the past 50 years. So what you're going to get out of this show, what people are going to get out of this show is an education in not just lore and mythology, but an education in the theology of Asatru, of the faith of the Aesir, Forn Seether, the customs of the past.
Yeah. Absolutely.
All right, man, I'm going to stop recording this.
All right, well, this has been Sacred Stew.